Hello, everyone. Happy Friday afternoon. We are going to get started in just a second. Let me show you a little video.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. We are Pre-Med CC, a student-led organization established in the fall of 2021. Our goal as an organization was to create an online community for pre-medical students at community colleges and universities with the hope of guiding the next generation of diverse and inclusive physicians.
And while we advertise our organization as being for community college students, our events are open to anyone. We realize that finding guidance and mentorship in a pre-med journey can be especially challenging for first-generation pre-med students, people that lack the financial resources, or just those that do not know people in the medical field.
One of the best parts about our events is that they are virtual, so you can do it from the comfort of your own home. We typically have events on Fridays from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. PST, and on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. PST.
If you aren't able to attend the event, all our sessions are uploaded on our YouTube channel. Many of our sessions will end with Q&A with our speakers. Any questions that you have can be put in the Q&A section on Zoom, and our team members will read them and have them answered.
After you have attended our event, you can log on to our website and complete the quiz, which will contain questions pertaining to our session today.
If you score 70% or higher on the quiz, you'll be awarded a 2-hour mentorship certificate to show that you attended our session today.
If you want to stay connected with our upcoming events or want to tell your pre-med friends about Pre-Med CC, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Pre-Med CC.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's session. I'll do a quick introduction and we'll get started. As the Director of MCAT for MedSchoolCoach, Dr. Ken Tao has emerged as a prominent figure in the realm of medical test preparation. His profound academic journey started at the University of California, Berkeley, where he dual majored, securing a Bachelor of Science in Bioengineering and a Bachelor of Arts in Molecular and Cell Biology. He also earned the Jeffrey A. Weiner Memorial Prize, an esteemed accolade given to the top graduating senior in the neurobiology, emphasis of the molecular and cell biology major. Further enriching his academic credentials, Dr. Tao acquired a PhD in neuroscience from Harvard University, with his scholarly contributions finding a place in prominent journals such as Neuron and Nature Metabolism. His reputation as an exceptional MCAT mentor is nationally recognized, given his vast experience working with thousands of undergraduate students as a graduate teaching assistant, adjunct faculty member, and an MCAT instructor tutor at the Princeton Review and MedSchoolCoach. His stellar record at the Princeton Review saw him as the only tutor certified in all subjects, one of their top-rated MCAT tutors, and a teacher trainer for their MCAT division. Dr. Tao's extensive teaching experience, exceeding 10,000 hours, along with the valuable content he has written for a multitude of MCAT books and guides, underscores his dedication and proficiency. This is further evidenced by the remarkable MCAT scores his students attain, many of whom have scored 40 plus on the old exam and 520 plus on the current exam. Welcome.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join us this evening. The topic of today's presentation is how to start studying for the MCAT as a community college in first and second year undergrad. This is the third part of a 3-part series that I delivered for this organization. We started first just talking about STEM and how to do well in those STEM courses. We then introduced the MCAT, right? Gave all of you some context on what the exam is about. And this third session is focusing on how can you start studying for the MCAT, right? And have to make this interactive. So at any point, if you have any questions, just let me know. And of course, you already heard the nice introduction of myself earlier, so I don't think I need to add much, but perhaps I just focus on my MCAT specific expertise, right? So I've been in the MCAT space now for 11 years. The first 5 years I was with the Princeton Review, and I was actually in the Berkeley office. So I would be teaching students at UC Berkeley, UC Davis, San Francisco State University, CSU East Bay, Stanford, right? All over the Bay Area. I was teaching the MCAT for the Princeton Review. And then when I moved to Boston to start graduate school, I was still working for the Princeton Review for a few years, and I had also become a teacher trainer for the Princeton Review. So I used to fly all across the country, training new individuals to become MCAT instructors for the Princeton Review. And while I was in Boston, I was discovered by the founder and CEO of MedSchoolCoach, who recruited me to start our own MCAT division, which has now been around for about 6 years. So that's your 11 years. And I'm really happy to be here, share my knowledge and expertise with all of you. So hopefully you'll leave this presentation with some new information that you've gained. So here's the plan for the day. We're going to discuss how you can study as a first or second year undergrad or community college student for the MCAT. And I'm then going to go into some more specific details on how you can prepare for each section of the exam. And then we'll have a Q&A section where I'll be happy to answer your questions. So it's a little funny because when I was first asked to give this presentation on how can you start preparing for the MCAT as a first or second year undergrad or community college student, my immediate response was actually, you don't, right? And that's because if I'm being honest, you shouldn't start your MCAT preparation as a freshman or a sophomore, right? MCAT is something that students will take in their junior or senior year of college. And for some students, they'll even take it after they graduate, right? So if you shouldn't be studying for the MCAT as a freshman or sophomore, what should you be doing? Well, as you can see here, you should be focusing on doing well in the prerequisite courses for MCAT, right? These are also the same courses that are required to apply to medical school. And all of them are listed here. You've got 2 semesters of general chemistry, 2 semesters of organic chemistry, 2 semesters of physics, 2 semesters of biology, 1 semester of biochemistry, psychology, and sociology. Now, do realize that there's some variation from campus to campus, right? So at some schools, instead of 2 semesters of general chemistry, they only take 1 semester of general chemistry, right? At some schools, depending on your major, you might take 1 semester or 2 semesters of biochemistry. It doesn't matter too much what your school has in terms of classes. There's a standard path that students will follow in terms of prerequisite courses for the MCAT. Now, the reason why it's important to focus on these classes as a pre-med and not on your MCAT is just because your MCAT is too far away, right? Nobody is going to study 3 to 4 years for the MCAT exam. And as a pre-med, realize your MCAT exam score is very important, but so is your GPA, right? And especially if you're a community college student, be wary that when you transfer to a 4-year institution, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to notice a very significant difference in the rigor of the college courses, right? So rather than trying to do MCAT studying at the same time, it's often better when you're starting out with these courses just to focus on learning the science content well and getting good grades, right? And in terms of learning the science content well, it'll also make your life much easier later on, because if you get straight A's in all of these science courses, later on when you're studying for the MCAT, you're not having to learn the materials from scratch. You simply have to review what you've already learned before, right? Compare that with a student who didn't do so well in these courses, right? If you get a C in organic chemistry, that means you probably didn't learn organic chemistry very well. And when you get to studying for the MCAT, you can't just review organic chemistry. You really have to learn organic chemistry correctly, and that requires a lot more effort, right? So focus first on doing well in your classes, and the MCAT you can think about later. Now, on the topic of coursework, there are a few additional points that I want to make, right? This is a point that I made in a previous presentation, which is don't take on additional majors or minors just because you're trying to impress medical school admissions committees or you're trying to stand out, right? Keep in mind that for medical schools, they mostly just care about your overall GPA, right? They don't care if you're an English major or a business major with a 4.0 GPA versus a biochemistry major or a chemical engineering major with a 4.0 GPA, right? So if you decide that you want to do something really interesting. You want to do something very difficult, right? You want to be a biochemistry and computer science double major with a minor in education and chemistry. Well, honestly, medical schools don't care. And what's going to happen is you're going to take a lot of courses and you're going to suffer, right? It's not fun having to take 20 plus units every semester. And when you're taking so many courses, realize that means you have less time to study for each class. So it's harder to get those straight A's. Plus, even if you get straight A's, all the extra time you're putting into those courses means less time for all of your extracurricular activities, right? Your clinical research, leadership, and volunteer experience. Plus the MCAT, right? Realize the MCAT is not a class. You have to find time to study for the MCAT. Now, the other point that you should consider is planning out your courses in advance. This isn't a huge issue if you're not planning on taking the MCAT early, right? If you're planning on waiting till after you graduate to take the MCAT, it's not a problem. But occasionally I speak with students who want to apply to medical school as what is called a traditional applicant, right? So the traditional applicant is one who goes to medical school immediately after finishing their undergraduate degree. And in these situations, what you have to do is take the MCAT before you apply to medical school, and you apply to medical school the summer after your junior year, right? And if you apply to medical school the summer after your junior year, that means during your senior year, you'll be interviewing at medical schools and hopefully getting accepted to a medical school. So the fall after you graduate, you matriculate to medical school. If you're one of those students who want to be a traditional applicant, planning out your coursework is more important because that means the latest you can take your MCAT is the spring of your junior year. But you might think, hey, is the spring of my junior year a good time to take my exam? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? Maybe you want to take the MCAT earlier, but keep in mind, the MCAT's only offered from the months of January through September each year. So you can't even take it in the fall of your junior year, right? So if you want to be a traditional applicant, you really have to take the MCAT either the summer after your sophomore year or the spring of your junior year. Now, the spring of your junior is a little bit more manageable because by then you'll have taken 5 to 6 semesters worth of courses. If you want to take the MCAT the summer after your sophomore year, that becomes a little bit tricky, especially with the chemistry series, right? At most institutions, you start with general chemistry, then you take organic chemistry, and then biochemistry. And if you're at a school where you have to take general chemistry 1 before you take general chemistry 2, before you can take organic chemistry 1, before you can take organic chemistry 2, and before you can take biochemistry, that means you can't miss a single semester of you can't miss a single semester of chemistry. And if you're starting in the fall of your freshman year, you're only able to take biochemistry in the fall of your junior year, right? So in that case, you can't really take the MCAT earlier than that. Otherwise, you won't have taken biochemistry and you'll be at a severe disadvantage when it comes to your MCAT. So at many institutions, they do allow you to take certain classes concurrently. For example, you might be able to take general chemistry 1 in the fall of your freshman year, and then in your spring, they might let you take general chemistry 2 along with organic chemistry 1, right? And then in the next fall of your sophomore year, you can take organic chemistry 2 and biochemistry in that spring, so that way you can take the MCAT that summer. So just something to think about if you're trying to apply as a traditional applicant, so you can be ready to take the MCAT by the summer of your sophomore year or the spring of your junior year. If you're not planning on applying as a traditional applicant, then this planning doesn't make as big of a difference because you have more flexibility in terms of when you take the MCAT. I'll also say that these days, traditional is sort of an archaic term because more and more students are taking gap years. So if anything, what we consider non-traditional students, the students who take gap years, is becoming more common than traditional applicants. The third point I'm going to make is research different classes and professors. Now, you might not have as many options at community college, but at most four-year institutions, any class that you take is not just offered once a year, right? Sometimes General Chemistry 1 is offered in the fall and it's offered in the spring. And if you're at some of the really big public universities, it'll be offered multiple times in one semester. The example I'll give is I went to UC Berkeley, and in the fall, I took general chemistry, which they call it Chem 1A. And in the fall, Chem 1A is offered 3 times. You can take Chem 1A at the 9 a.m. lecture time, at the 11 a.m. lecture time, or the 1 p.m. lecture time. It also gives you a sense of how big these public universities are, because every single one of these lectures was in a lecture hall that could accommodate 500 students. So in the fall, you essentially had close to 1,500 students taking General Chemistry 1. So why do you want to do some research? Well, the reality is that not all professors are equal, right? And at many of these large institutions, they're not teaching institutions. They're honestly research institutions where the professors there are focusing on research. They're not focusing on teaching. So because of that, their research labs are phenomenal. They are doing groundbreaking research. Some of them are going to win Nobel Prize and prizes in the future, but they can be not so fantastic professors, right? And I will say that I know of a very notable example, right? A very famous professor at UC Berkeley who is very likely going to win a Nobel Prize in the next decade or so. The lectures that this professor gave, they literally just read off the slides, right? So it's almost like, what's the point of me going to lecture if all you're going to do is read off the slide? And so many students were excited because this person had won so many awards and such. So do some research, because some professors care more about teaching than others. And also, some professors are a little bit more lenient when it comes to grading. And I say this pretty literally because there are some cases where if you took general chemistry in the fall, 20% of the students could get an A in that class. But if you took general chemistry in the spring, 25% of the students could get an A in the fall. And that's simply because of how the professor decided to grade the students. These are all worth looking into. And if you're not sure which classes and which professors are good, you can always talk to some of your upperclassmen, right? And they might tell you, oh, hey, this professor is really good, but they only teach in the spring. So wait to take it next spring. And the last one, don't pack too many difficult courses together. So the difficult courses are essentially your hard science courses: biology, general chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, and such. So generally, my recommendation is try not to take more than 2 of these classes a semester, right? If you have to take 3 of these in one semester, it starts to get to be a lot of work. And keep in mind, for a lot of these science classes, you also have lab. So let's say you decide, hey, this semester, I want to take organic chemistry, physics, and biology. You've got 3 lectures to deal with. You might also have 3 labs, and labs are often 3 to 4 hours. So imagine having 3 4-hour labs every week for an entire semester. It's not very fun, right? So as much as possible, just try to take 2 hard science courses at a time. You can spread them out, make it easier on yourself, get a higher GPA, have more time on extracurricular activities to build your application. All right. So next, I want to talk a little bit about how to prepare for exams, right? Because I did say in your first 2 years, either at community college or at an undergrad institution, instead of focusing on the MCAT exam, you should focus on doing well in your classes. I've talked a little bit about how you need to take certain classes to be ready for the MCAT, and I also talked a little bit about scheduling, but I want to talk more details on how to actually do well in these courses. So the first thing that's really quite important is at some point in the university, you need to figure out your schedule. You cannot rely on your memory forever. At some point, you're going to forget about a homework assignment, or you're going to forget about a midterm exam, or you're going to forget about an important club or lab meeting that you're supposed to go to, and it's going to create all sorts of problems. You need to figure out a system that works well for you. For some students, they will have physical journals and calendars that they will use, right? So every time they have another homework assignment, they'll open up their physical planners and write, okay, next Thursday, I'm going to this meeting at 6 p.m. And they operate using that planner. For myself, I essentially started using Google Calendar, and Google Calendar is still what I use to this day because it's extremely convenient for scheduling meetings and scheduling recurring meetings. You can simply put on your calendar, hey, from this week until the end of April, I'm going to have general chemistry on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., and Google Calendar can map that out onto your calendar. You should also use that to map out important class events, particularly midterms exams, final exams, project deadlines, paper deadlines, and such. All of this so you can plan accordingly. And the situations that you really want to try to avoid are a week where you've got 3 midterms. Now, I know in college, students often like to laugh over such situations. And sometimes students will sort of seek attention, saying, oh, look at my schedule. I have a terrible week. I have 3 midterms this week, trying to get maybe some empathy from their friends, and their friends will laugh it off. But keep in mind that the only person who's going to be suffering that week is you, right? Now, if you have 3 midterms in 1 week, sometimes you can't do anything about it. That just happens to be your class schedule. But if you plan accordingly, based on what I said earlier, hopefully it's only 2 hard science classes, and the 3rd class isn't too bad. Now, if you also know with your schedule, hey, this week I'm going to have 3 midterm exams, then you know to plan ahead of time. I probably should not be working that weekend or participate in any extracurricular activities that weekend, so I have more time to study, and you might even start preparing for those midterm exams early enough. Number 2, if you want to do well in your classes, make sure to obtain all the study materials that you need to succeed in class. One of the unfortunate aspects of universities and classes is textbooks. Textbooks are expensive. They were hundreds of dollars when I took the classes, and I'm sure they've probably increased, right? Essentially, you're spending hundreds of dollars each semester on textbooks. I know it's unfortunate, but you do need to make sure you get the resources that you need to succeed. I do know going through my undergraduate courses, sometimes there were students who didn't buy textbooks because they were too expensive and they didn't have the source text that the professors were using to teach the material, and they suffered for that reason, right? So I know it's tough, they're expensive, but if you need the course materials to do well, make sure you get those course materials. And there are always ways to get those materials at a cheaper price, whether it's purchasing them from an upperclassman, getting older edition of the book. There are ways to get around it, but you certainly don't want to take a class and not have the study resources you need to do well. In addition to textbooks, realize that there are other study resources that are important. There are some professors that will assign practice questions out of another textbook. They might assign online homework, in which case you probably have to get it. Otherwise, you're not going to get credit for the homework assignments. But something else that's really helpful for your studies are old midterm and final exams. Anytime you can get a hand on previous midterm and final exams from the professor whom you're taking the course from, that will be immensely helpful for your practice, because those professors honestly don't change their exams that much. They might change a molecule here and there, but the format of the exams, the way you're tested on the science content, is usually consistent. Number 3, I shouldn't have to say this, but be a good student, right? Go to class and pay attention. I know in college, this is a situation where you're essentially free. You're not in high school. You're not shuttled from class to class. Nobody is going to get upset at you for skipping class. And for many of these classes, attendance isn't required either. But if you want to do with these classes, you need to be a good student. And for most classes, maybe the exception I gave was the one earlier with a, pretty terrible professor. In most cases, you should plan on going to class, pay attention, take notes, ask questions, go to office hours. That's how you're supposed to study for those classes, and that's how you can do well in those classes. If you're someone who signs up for an 8 a.m. class and skips class half the semester, it's going to be tough for you to do well. So these are things that you should keep in mind of if you want to do well. All right. Next, you need to develop a study approach. This is something that a lot of students, when they're first starting out as a first or second year community college or undergraduate student, they haven't figured out. And it's for this reason that a lot of these students, their freshman year, in the fall and the spring, they don't do so well in their classes, right? They might get 3.0 GPA, 3.2 GPA, a lot of Bs, maybe a C as well. A lot of this is because they have not figured out how they should study for their classes. And keep in mind, there's not a set way for all students to study. Some students will study one way, other students will study a different way, but you need to find a way that works for you. And Jubin, did you have an announcement you want to make?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add this is that if you're in a community college, you have much smaller classes. Like when I took general chemistry, I think we started with 32 people and we're around 25. How many did you have when you were at Berkeley in your
I
general
said earlier,
chemistry?
1,500.
Yeah. And so I think this is like a really big thing you can do is you have much smaller classes. So getting your professors, I think on average you're spending 3 hours of lecture and 6 hours of lab, and that's 9 hours a week that you will be with that same professor. So uh, getting to their office hours or getting to know them, it's a really good opportunity. Also, it helps with your letters too, letters of recommendation. So just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say there's so many students who I speak to. They are currently working on building their application and they're now struggling to find professors who are willing to write them a letter of recommendation. I literally had a conversation with a student yesterday and they were saying, there's this professor who I had gotten to know them pretty well, and I was planning on asking them for a letter of recommendation. I sent them an email, hey, can you write me a letter of recommendation? The professor wrote back, oh, you actually got a B in my class. Are you sure you want me to write you a letter? So a lot of these things you do need a plan, right? You need to make sure you do well in these classes. And of course, you also need to make sure you develop a good relationship. Because if you get an A in a course, but you never introduced yourself to the professor, then what are they going to write in your letter, right? It'll be like, hello, I'm writing a letter for Ken. He got an A in the class. That's it, right? Okay. Now, going back to developing a study approach, different students will have different approaches. Some students enjoy studying with others. They like study groups. For other students, it doesn't work. You don't have to force yourself to go to study groups if it doesn't work for you. And at the same time, if you don't like studying by yourself, you don't have to study by yourself. Same thing, if you enjoy studying in your bedroom on your bed, that's fine. Just make sure it actually works and it's just not yourself falling asleep. Same thing with if you like going to a cafe or going to a library, figure out something that works for you. I have been to so many libraries during midterms and final exams, and I just see so many students have with their head down and they're just sleeping. So find something that actually works for you when you're trying to study for your classes. Now, other things to consider is when there's lectures, when there's textbook readings, what are you going to do? There's some students who they'll read the textbooks and it works well for them, right? They like reading the textbook because it provides them some context on the science content before they go to lecture, and they feel that it helps them understand the lecture better. There's other students who they prefer going to lecture first and then afterwards reading the textbook again. There's students who like to take notes while they're reading textbooks. There's other students who don't bother taking notes while they're reading textbooks. There are students who like to use flashcards to help review and memorize science content. There are other students who like to make study guides. It honestly does not matter. You simply have to find a method that works for you, and by work, that means it has to allow you to get A's in your classes. One other thing is, if you're at a university where they record the lectures, sometimes it can be convenient because if you have a professor who talks very quickly, it might be tough for you to keep up, and you can't really take notes. So in that case, you might feel like you're wasting your time going to class, and it's much more effective for you to just stay at home where you can take notes, you can pause the lecture at any point, go back and rewind, and rewatch any part of the lesson to help take good notes. All of these things are good to keep in mind, but the main thing is you need to find something that works for you if you want to do well in these classes. From here, I do want to transition from how to do well in your classes to talk about each of the different sections of the exam and how you can do well in each of those sections. So first is the Chem Phys section, right? The Chem Phys section is the chemical physical foundations of biological systems. This is the first section of the exam. Reasons for why this section is difficult, there are several, right? The first is that it integrates a broad range of subjects. This includes general chemistry, biochemistry, physics, organic chemistry, and biology. This is notable because at most college institutions, if you think, how much general chemistry did I have to know for my general chemistry class in order to do well in my organic chemistry class? My answer is almost nothing, right? And that's how college courses are set up. They're essentially modules that are more or less independent from each other. You go from general chemistry, which is very quantitative with chemical formulas, stoichiometry, acid base, equilibrium calculations, to organic chemistry, where suddenly you're doing a lot of drawing. You're drawing molecules, you're drawing arrow pushing diagrams. That's not how the MCAT works. The MCAT's going to require you to integrate these different subjects together. How can general chemistry apply to organic chemistry and vice versa? And also, how is physics applied to general chemistry? This can make the Chem Phys section difficult for students. And the second reason why the Chem Phys section is difficult is what I call the luck factor. The Chem Phys section has 59 questions. 25% is physics. So if you do the math, that means on test day, you can expect 14 to 15 physics questions. That's not a lot of questions, but what's fair game on the exam for physics? Well, it's anything from physics 1 and physics 2, which includes kinematics, forces, work and energy, fluids, electrostatics, circuits, waves, light, sound, optics. I've named a lot of subjects in there. And the point that I'm trying to make is in any one administration of the MCAT exam, there's no way for you to be tested on every single physics topic that can show up on the exam. So on one administration of MCAT, you might see a lot of topics from physics 1, but on another administration of the MCAT, you might see a lot more topics from physics 2. This is what I call the luck factor, because sometimes students are stronger in the topics from physics 1. Maybe they got an A in physics 1, but they're less confident with the topics in physics 2 because they got a B+. The third reason is it requires a complex set of reasoning skills. It's not simply memorizing the science content. It's being able to reason through and apply the science concepts to the passages on the exam. And here you can actually see the specific skills that is required in the 3 science sections. Yes, you need to know You need to have knowledge of the science principles, but you also need problem-solving skills. You need to understand research design, and you need to be able to understand basic data analysis and statistics. And finally, there's math. There's a lot of time pressure that students have from doing calculation questions. If you're someone who's not great at math, the Chem Phys section might present more of an issue because it takes you more time to do math. In addition, there are a lot of equations and constants you have to have memorized. So these are a lot of the reasons why the Chem Phys section is difficult for students. And of course, I do want to leave you with a tip of how to overcome this section, and that's commit high yield content to memory. And the high yield content is essentially content that shows up repeatedly over many administrations of the exam. I told you earlier there's a luck factor, but there's still high yield topics and low yield topics. High yield topics are pretty much guaranteed to show up on every administration of the MCAT. These include topics such as amino acids, cellular respiration, acid-base chemistry, and such. When you know these are the high yield topics on the exam, make sure to have memorized all of this high yield information. At the same time, for physics as well as general chemistry, there are some equations and constants that you need to have memorized. Committing this high yield information to your memory will help your Chem Phys score. Let's now talk about the second section of the exam, the critical analysis or reasoning skill section of the exam, which is also called the CAR section. This is the section of the exam that doesn't require any prerequisite knowledge of science content. So a lot of students think it's going to be easy, but many students are just not very good at reading passages on social studies and humanities topics and answering questions on them. So what are the specific reasons why the CAR section is this difficult? It's actually what I said earlier. There's no content knowledge required. Because there's no content knowledge required, a lot of students think, oh, I don't have to study for the CAR section. But that's very much not the case. If you don't study and prepare for the CAR section, how are you ever going to be able to improve? Number two, critical analysis and reasoning skills can be difficult to obtain. There's no CARS course that you take as part of your university classes. You're going to take general chemistry, you're going to take biology, organic chemistry, and such, but you're not going to take critical analysis and reasoning skills. So for a lot of students, this is not something that college prepares them for. Number three, the passages do cover a broad range of disciplines in the humanities and social studies. And here you can actually see all of the different topics that can show up with the CARS section. And with these different topics, some of them, you'll be able to read them and not have too many issues, right? You might feel pretty confident about psychology, sociology, and these passages on really tangible things, right? Population health. You want to become a physician, you understand that well. But then there are these other passages on more abstract concepts, on art theory, on music theory, on religion, on philosophy, and you read the passage and you don't understand anything that you've just read. That is another reason why the CAR section is difficult. And the last reason is time pressure. 90 minutes, 9 passages, 53 questions. That's not a lot of time. For many students, when they first complete a CAR section, they run out of time. They might only have time to complete 67 passages and have to guess on the remaining 2 to 3 passages. The time pressure is not easy to deal with. So of course, what are some tips to improve in the CAR section? Well, number one, CARS, you can see in this diagram, it's kind of like going to the gym, right? You of course need to go to the gym regularly if you want to build muscles. You can't just one day go to the gym and work out for 2 hours and take a 3-month break and decide you're going to go work out again. You're not going to see any improvement. The same is true for CARS. If you don't do CARS practice regularly and you decide, okay, my MCAT is in 3 weeks, the CARS section is doing kind of bad. Let me do a whole bunch of practice this week and I'm going to do 100 passages this weekend. You're probably not going to see any improvement. The CARS section, it's really difficult to improve your score because you almost have to completely change the way that you read text. You cannot read a CARS passage the same way you read science passages, where you're focusing on the details, you're focusing on the facts. When it comes to CARS passages, you're focused on much more not abstract. You're focusing on emotions and valence. What are the words that the author is choosing to use to describe a topic? And based on the words that the author is selecting, are they in favor of this topic, or are they against this topic? It's not enough just to say, hey, this passage is about recycling. It's important to figure out, what exactly is the author saying? Is the author in favor of recycling, or are they against recycling? These are not things that are easy for students to pick up when they're used to reading for scientific facts with their science textbooks. Another tip I can give is also, on this idea of the author. Many students, when they read these passages, they just read it without really thinking about what they're reading. Keep in mind, every single passage is written by an author, and that author has some goal. So it can be helpful when you're reading a CARS passage to think, who is the audience of this CARS passage? And what is the author trying to convince this audience of? If you can have that context in mind, that can also help you to understand the arguments and ultimately the central thesis of the passage. A third section is the Bio-Chem section. This section is more so going to parallel the Chem Phys section because these are the two natural science sections. So reasons why it's difficult is sort of similar to before. It tests a variety of different subjects, and it also requires the same set of complex reasoning skills you saw for the Chem Phys section, but an added layer of complexity here are research passages. Many of you may not know this, but the MCAT is not written by physicians, which is kind of funny because you're thinking, hey, if I'm taking the MCAT, shouldn't it be written by MDs or DOs? Well, as it turns out, the MCAT is actually written by PhDs, which are also doctors, but not the medical doctor that you're aspiring to become. And the impact of the MCAT being written by PhDs is that most of the passages are going to be adapted from scientific journal articles. If you're someone who doesn't have basic science research experience, you may have a lot of challenge understanding these research passages. And of course, if you can't understand these passages well, it's going to make it very difficult for you to answer the questions correctly. So of course, what you can do is get practice with reading scientific literature. This is not something that is super easy to do on your own. You can certainly Google PubMed and just start looking up scientific journal articles. You can do that, but it's actually much easier if you join a research lab. Because if you join a research lab, in a basic science research lab, you're going to be part of a research project, and whichever person you're working with, your research mentor, which is sometimes the PI, but sometimes it's also a graduate student or a postdoc, they'll help explain the question that the lab is interested in answering, and what are the experiments that the lab is performing to answer these questions. And as part of that exercise, they'll often send you a few journal articles that you can read over to gain context on what the experiments the lab is focused on. And when you do so, this is your opportunity to practice reading these passages. And you can look at the data, try to understand, hey, they did this data, they did this experiment with these DNA and RNA molecules. How did they draw these conclusions? That will help you with the scientific jargon. And another thing that can be helpful is when you read a lot of these passages, realize they're talking about some kind of a complex system and pathway. When you read a paragraph of text, it can be hard to visualize that. So sometimes it can be helpful to draw out diagrams or schematics of what's being described in the text. The last section is the psych-soc section. The psych-soc section is what students often consider to be the easiest section of the exam. And in some ways, it is the easiest section because psychology and sociology, they're easier to learn on your own. Reinforcement, punishment, it's not that hard to understand. Hey, if I do well in this exam, I get a cookie. Oh, that cookie makes me want to take the exam more. Right? Sorry, makes me want to do well in the exam more. These topics in psychology and sociology are a little easier for students to understand because in some cases, they simply seem like common sense. You just didn't know that there was a term for them. But you compare that with organic chemistry, you can't just start drawing organic chemistry reactions without taking a class. So that's one of the reasons why students often think the psych-social section is easy, but there's still reasons why not all students get good scores in the psych-social section. And the first is there's quite a lot of content that's tested on the psych-social section. There's a lot of vocabulary words, and some of them are pretty similar, and you have to be able to know what's the difference between some of these terms, such as the representativeness heuristic, right? Versus fundamental attribution error versus self-serving bias, right? There's a lot of these different terms that you have to learn and have memorized. Another reason why it's difficult is because it's also the newest section of the exam. And many of you may not know, but the MCAT went through a pretty substantial revision in 2015. So the psych-social section is actually less than 10 years old. And I know you might be thinking, well, it's pretty much 8 years old now. That's not new. And it's correct, it's not new, but also that means we only have 8 years of experience with the psych-social section of MCAT. There's no MCAT expert out there with more than 8 years of experience with the psych-social section because it's a fairly new section of the exam. So the number of experts out there on the psych-social section, there's not that many. Plus, because the section is new, I don't think the AMC has fully figured out what exactly they want to test students on in the psych-social section. So every time there's another administration of MCAT, another practice exam they release, we learn more about the section of the exam. Third reason is similar to before, just as with the Bio-Chem section, there is a focus on research passages and experiments, but these passages and experiments are a little easier to understand because they're often describing individuals and participants. For example, they might say, hey, a group of college students were recruited to test the effects of sleep on interpersonal relationships. That's not that hard to understand. If I give you an example from the Bio-Chem section, a researcher harvested a tissue sample from adenocarcinoma. They used a lysis buffer to lyse all of the cells and used affinity chromatography to isolate the albumin proteins, right? That, for many students, I probably already lost you. And that's just because scientific experiments in the Chem Phys and Bio-Chem sections are usually harder to understand than in the psych-social section. The last reason is exam fatigue. Remember, the MCAT is 7.5 hours long. The psych-social section is the last section. And for many students, by the time they get to the psych-social section, their brains are wiped. They're exhausted. And even though you have 95 minutes on this section, there are so many students who finish early, they'll finish in 45 minutes or 50 minutes and leave with half of the time unused because they just can't process the information anymore, and they just want to be done, which is not great because, of course, if you want to get the highest score possible, you want to use your full 95 minutes, carefully review the passage, questions, and answer choices. And psych-social section, combination of psychology and sociology, it is weighted more towards psychology. So what is the tip that I can give you? The tip is address content issues early on. I said earlier that the psych-social section is very much focused on memorization. It's also one of those sections where the more time you spend reviewing the content, the more quickly your scores are going to improve. It's different from the Chem Phys and Bio-Chem sections in that those sections are more focused on understanding concepts and scientific laws. This one is just memorize a ton of science content. And for many of these topics, realize you're going to have to review them over and over again because you're likely going to confuse them. because there's so much content, and a lot of the science content is quite similar to each other. So those are essentially the points that I wanted to make, right? Really starting out by talking about what should you do in your first 2 years of school. Honestly, focus on doing well in your classes. Now, once you do get to the point of studying for the MCAT, please keep in mind the tips that I left, and you may find that helpful for your MCAT prep down the line. And at this point, I am, of course, happy to take questions, and I do see several questions in the chat, but if you have additional questions, please feel free to submit them in the chat.
Alrighty, so for our first question, how many times can we take the MCAT?
That is an excellent question. And in some cases, I think it's a little silly because how many times do you want to take the MCAT, right? I should hope that you really want to take the MCAT once and be done, right? But the answer is you can take the MCAT 3 times in 1 year, 4 times in 2 years, and 7 times in your lifetime. So the AAMC is capping it at 7 times, but honestly, you don't want to take the MCAT 7 times. Also, you can't take the MCAT without preparation because that's actually going to hurt your medical school application. This isn't the SAT and ACT where you can screw around and take those exams however many times you want and choose what score you send. Medical schools will see every score that you have for the MCAT. And if you have weak scores on your MCAT, that does hurt your application. So the ideal plan is wait until you're ready to take the MCAT take it once, and that's it.
Our next question we have is, are you able to finish all the prereq courses to get into med school at community college, or do you have to transfer to a 4-year to get access to upper division courses?
At most institutions, it's likely going to end up being a combination. Remember what I said earlier, just think about the chemistry series. In many schools, it's going to take 5 semesters in order to take all of the different chemistry classes. So I think for most students, it's going to be a combination of some of the classes they'll take at their community college and other classes they'll take at a 4-year institution. Do keep in mind, though, that the rigor of the courses at a 4-year institution is often more difficult at a community college. That may not be great for your GPA, but it can be good for your MCAT because it likely means that you will learn the material in more detail at a 4-year institution than perhaps in a community college course.
Alrighty, for our next question, how is the MCAT structured? Is it multiple choice? Also, would you recommend investing in MCAT practice tests?
So if you're not familiar with the format of the MCAT, I would highly recommend checking out the second webinar that I gave this year. So it was actually from last week, and I'm sure Jubin can link it in the chat for students to check out. In that presentation, I go through the format of the MCAT in detail, but indeed, it is a multiple choice test, and you should plan on taking multiple MCAT practice exams before you take the actual exam.
Do you have any advice for becoming a part of any research lab?
Yes, you pretty much have a couple of options. Number one, if you have connections, ask those connections to get you in a lab. Or at most universities, there are research labs, and the most common strategy is honestly cold emails. You simply just have to go on a website. Maybe it's the neurobiology department. You look up the professors, you see which ones have a lab. You spend some time reviewing the information in their lab, and you send them an email saying, hello, my name is so-and-so. I'm an undergraduate student at the school. I am looking for a research position, and I saw that your lab works on this topic. Are you open and willing to take on another volunteer in your lab? And I know I said volunteer. You cannot expect your first research experience to be a paid experience because you likely have no experience that they would want to pay you for.
Yeah, the other thing that I would just add is that we've done a ton of things on summer programs, and go look at them. Those are paid programs that you could do in the summer, do research, get paid, get experience, but then you could also leverage it for a post-bac job or other labs and stuff, and throw that up.
Alrighty, so our next question is just a general, what are the best resources to use for studying for the MCAT?
So there's a lot of different resources out there. The most important resource are definitely the AMC practice materials. The AMC are the creators of the MCAT exam. All of the practice exams and practice questions they've released are from previous administrations of MCAT, and they're going to be the most similar to what you see on test day. So definitely get the AMC practice materials, pick up a set of MCAT books. In here, you can pick up a set of books from any of the large companies, Kaplan, Princeton Review, Berkeley Review, Exam Crackers, Blueprint, any set of MCAT books is fine. And from there, you might want to pick up some additional practice resources. So there's a lot of different question banks out there, but that's what I would say sort of in order of priority. And there's a whole bunch of other supplemental resources out there, Khan Academy, YouTube, and such.
All right. When is the best time to take the MCAT if you don't want to take a gap year?
Summer after your sophomore year or the spring of your junior year.
All right, next question. How long does the MCAT preparation usually take? Would you recommend preparing for at least a year?
Depends on the student. I will say that most students prepare for 3 to 6 months. If you're preparing for 3 months, it's usually over the summer and you're studying full-time for the exam. If it's 6 months, it's usually during school and you're studying part-time, maybe 15 to 20 hours per week. 1 year in advance, this would be for students who are looking for very significant improvements. For example, you take a practice exam, you scored a 487 and you want a 515. In those cases, 3 to 6 months is probably not enough, and a year in advance is reasonable. I would not go more than a year, right? If you're more than a year out from studying from the MCAT, you should probably just focus on your classes.
All right. Would you recommend taking biochem while studying for the MCAT in the summer before junior year?
It's not a bad idea. So biochemistry is a really, really important subject. After biology, biochemistry is the most important natural science subject, which means biochemistry is higher yield on the MCAT than general chemistry, organic chemistry, and physics. And if you take biochemistry the summer that you're also planning to take an MCAT, it's kind of nice because studying for your biochemistry class is also studying for the MCAT.
Alrighty, next question is, so if you're satisfied with your MCAT score, how long are those scores considered valid or not expired for med school applications?
At most schools, it is 3 years. 3 years is the standard. There are some institutions that are a little bit different. The best way to check, of course, is once you put together your school list, go to each school's website. They do have an admissions page where they will list the requirements. There's always an MCAT section, and they will describe how many years your MCAT score will be accepted at that institution. But at almost all schools, it's 3 years.
All right. Is it a good idea to take a gap year? I know a lot of people who are doing it to get a good grade in the MCAT.
Yeah. Taking a gap year can only strengthen your application. Keep in mind, most students who are traditional applicant don't have that much success with getting into medical school. And that's because as a traditional applicant, you only have 3 years of experience on your application, right? Medical schools don't care about anything you did in high school unless you found the cure to cancer, right? So if you're applying as a traditional applicant, you only have your freshman, sophomore, and junior years of experience in your application. Compare that to someone who's taking a gap year. They have a whole extra year of experience on their application. Someone who takes 2 gap years, it only builds from there. So the more gap years you have, the more unique you are as a student, the more stories you can tell, and the stronger your extracurricular experiences. Honestly, if you're applying as a traditional applicant, in those 3 years, you probably didn't have much time except to take your classes, take the MCAT, do some clinical research volunteer experience, but because you don't have much depth, right, you appear as what is often considered a cookie cutter pre-med, as in you checked all the boxes, but you don't have that much experience in any one area. So a gap year is great. A gap year is a nice way for you to distinguish yourself. If you're someone who's very interested in research, you can spend a year doing research. If you're interested in education, you can go do Teach for America. If you're interested in global health, you can, go to the Peace Corps. You can do something international that can really make your application stand out.
Do you think
All right. He has to go at 6 or he's gonna hurt me. The other thing is you guys are asking a lot of questions, like when is the best time to take the MCAT? What's the best time for you? Because we could say it's, I don't know, December 25th. That might work for you, one person, may not work for you. And so some of the other questions that are coming up are a lot of things that deans of admission have addressed that. And so gonna try to get those answered. But Dr. Tao has to go, and again, you guys are asking a lot of questions about medical school, and we have coming up the deans of admission from Irvine, UCLA, USC, Riverside. I think we have, and then I think we have an Yale, I think too. So come and ask those questions from them. Like Dr. Tao is an expert on MCAT and knows a lot about med school admission, but ask the deans from that. But he has to go, so I'm gonna let you go before you turn into a pumpkin. So go. And
Thanks, everyone. Have a night.
yeah, and I think people are asking about children, negative medical school. No. How to pay for medical school. We've done 3 sessions on financial aid and paying for medical school. The other question has come up is, should I take my lower division at community college? Yeah, so most people spend 3 years at a community college. I think the average graduation rate for a degree is about 5 years now. So you could take any of your lower division courses at a community college, even if it takes 4 years. Granted, some people have to work. Some people have children and other responsibilities that they have to take care of. So by all means, if it's going to take you 4 years, it's going to take you 4 years. And so, yeah, so don't get too caught up in this numbers game. And somebody's asking children and negative. Actually, we've had a couple of people that were single parents in medical school and undergrad, and it does not matter at all. Somebody's asking, is a low GPA cancel all your chances? No, it doesn't. And we've had deans of admission that have talked about this. We have actually somebody who's going to speak in a couple of weeks that failed 13 classes and got into a top, I think top 10 or top 20 medical school. So no, low GPAs don't. Do you think as a senior in high school, you could sign a contract to skip the MCAT? I'm sure that there's programs that are accelerated, like BS and MD programs, but I think even the BS MD programs require you to take an MCAT and have a certain number, but check check that as well. But the MCAT, I can tell you this right now, there's not that many US medical schools that make you bypass the MCAT. It just what would they be talking about low GPA? We've had 37 deans of admission. They've all talked about that. We actually had a dean or vice president of the UC medical schools that basically she failed OChem and she retook it and got into medical school. And so we've had a lot of talks about low GPA and what you can do. How can you receive? So you could go on our website and we have a list serve, and you could get get on our list serve and get updates from all of our events. We also post a lot of things on our social media that we don't send you emails. So how can you access the recordings of previous MCAT workshops? They're all on our YouTube channel. Also, if you look at our past events, we have the links to all of our PowerPoints as well that posted there, but also a link to the videos as well. So, I've heard there are other alternatives instead of the MCAT. If you want to go to medical school, you have to take the MCAT, period. There's no ifs and buts about it. There's the GRE that are for other programs like public health, but the MCAT is for medical school. If you take the MCAT the summer before your junior year and do not get into medical school right after college, so the MCAT is valid for about 3 years. Some medical schools have a 3-year limit. Some of them have 4 years. But yes, if you are within that 3-year period and you didn't get in, you're going to have to take the MCAT again. What are your advice to students who are in 12th grade in high school? Gosh, enjoy high school, man. Don't stress about the MCAT in high school. I would just say, and then they want to go to community college. Yeah, just transfer, go to a community college, do well, and transfer. But yeah, what's COC? I don't know what that is. I don't know if you put in there what COC is. I don't know what COC is. But yeah, you're fine if you're a freshman. Just do well in your classes. I think the best thing with college grades, and I think he did this 2 weeks ago about how to study for STEM courses. Just be somebody who learns how to study and how to manages. Is public health a good pre-med major? Sure, um if you like public health and you